Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast and of the Pauper format panel. And today we made an announcement about a change we are making in Pauper. We are banning High Tide, or rebanning High Tide, as the case might be. Back in March, we unbanned High Tide as something new. We were calling a trial unban. At this time, we unbanned Prophetic Prism and High Tide as ways to give tools back into the environment, to see how they performed, if they were safe to be unbanned, and kind of how things were going to work out with them. Now, in the case of Prophetic Prism, it's here to stay. We unbanned it, it's been just fine, it's shown up a little bit here and there in Tron decks, a couple other places, but mostly been totally okay, and is a great thing to kind of take off the ban list and put back into the format. High Tide is a much more nuanced and complicated topic. Now, before we go any further, I'm just going to read you what we said back in March when we unbanned High Tide about the kind of metrics we'd be looking at to decide if High Tide is going to stick around in the format or not. We said, our hope is that the deck ends up, at best, an option in the metagame beneath the very best decks. If it ends up not being played after some experimentation, that's a fine outcome. If it ends up fringe or playable, but not in the best decks, that's the ideal outcome. These scenarios will leave it unbanned. If it breaks through and enables one of the 3 most successful decks in the metagame, however, we will likely ban High Tide again at the end of the trial. Having a kill from hand combo deck as one of the best 3 decks can be frustrating. Not every color can interact with that stretch super well. Now, in the end, High Tide has kind of towed the line here. Some weeks it's been above the line, some weeks it's been a little below the line, but it's definitely been in the conversation as a strong deck in the format. But when you combine that with a couple other factors, such as the impact on tournament play, as well as some of the impacts it has on the format in general, we've decided to reban it at this time. Let me get into why and the different pillars of why now. So High Tide kind of started off slow. It took a little bit of time for folks to find the best version of it, but over time they've kind of coalesced on this Psychic Puppetry build, where you're splicing onto Arcane to untap a bunch of your lands, to just keep getting mana over and over again, and kind of either stay even on mana or net mana as you cast cards like Reach Through Mist, Peer Through Depths, and so on. Now, in terms of win rate, the deck started with just about above a 50% win rate. Nothing spectacular. And it didn't make any huge waves at events like Pauper. It showed up a little bit, but did not make the top 8 or anything like that. However, as time has gone on, we have seen that win rate continue to increase, 51, 52, 53, some weeks as high as 55 or 56%, which is pretty strong in terms of how much impact a deck has on the metagame. And many weeks, indeed, High Tide has been one of the best decks to play in the metagame. Now that's mostly according to Magic Online data, of course, which is a little tough to parse through, and real-world tournament results as well, just because there are so few High Tide players compared to everything else. Normally, when a deck starts doing pretty well, it adopts a lot of players playing it. But in the case of a complicated combo deck like High Tide, historically, that's just not the case. If you look at Amulet Titan in Modern, or even decks in Eternal formats like Storm, even when they're doing very well, a lot of players don't quite gravitate to the Storm decks as much, or the combo decks as much, just because they're so difficult to play, and really require a certain kind of pilot to want to be able to play them in the first place. And while a bit of that is conjecture, it does track with what we've seen historically, as these decks are not adopted as much. So from week to week, we can see some pretty big differences in how High Tide does, because the player pool is not that large playing it. With that said, the numbers are pretty clear that High Tide is one of the better decks in the format. And depending on the week you look at, like I said, it definitely toes that line of being one of those 3 best decks. But this, in concert with some other factors, is what really caused us to unban it. So let's go on to the second part here, which is the impact on tournament play. Now, High Tide is certainly a deck with plenty of pedigree of slow turns. Anyone who's played Legacy and old High Tide decks, that's no surprise whatsoever. But I think this version might actually be the slowest version we've ever seen, for a number of different reasons. One is that there's just no hammer that the deck can play to finish the game. There's no Mind's Desire for a bunch of cards, clearly the game is over, or even sometimes a Time Spiral to reset things. It's not clear as you're going through the combo that your opponent is dead up until the very end a lot of the time. I even myself built up High Tide. I have my copy right here. I brought it to Pauper to play in side events with it. And man, the deck does take a long time. I'm a pretty experienced High Tide pilot. I played it all the way back in Legacy. I played this version a decent amount. And even then I was taking 10 plus minutes often to kill people with the combo. And as I was going through my combo, it wasn't clear to me until very late in the process if my opponent was going to be dead or not. I had no idea. In fact, many players conceded to me when I was pretty sure I was going to fizzle, just because we've been going for 8 or 9 or 10 minutes, and it was safe to assume I was going to combo them out, when that wasn't really the case. And while I don't want to ascribe too much to a specific game or a handful of events that I played in, overall the sentiment from a lot of people is just that it's miserable to play against. You will sit there for 10 or 15 minutes at a time while your opponent is going through the motions, and you kind of just wait to see if the game is over or not. And if they fizzle, well, you probably win the game. And if they win the game, well, you don't get to take another turn at all. It's a very miserable play experience. And while it's far from the only deck that can take a long time to execute, for example, Familiars, at least when Familiars is done, you get to take another turn, you get to keep playing Magic, and maybe you're in a really bad spot, but you get to keep playing the game, as opposed to High Tide where, well, if they go for it, you're just dead if it works out. Additionally, a deck like Familiars use creatures, which are a lot easier to interact with in the Pauper card pool than a combo deck that kills from hand. Now, all of this compounds things in terms of tournament logistics, because not only is it incredibly unfun to play against if your opponent's taking these 10 or 15-minute combo turns sometimes, but if this combo turn begins or is going on while extra turns is called, it can make an event run drastically over. Now, while neither of these are a reason on their own for a ban, for example, we're not taking Cycle Storm out of the format, even though it has some very long turns, that combined with the win rate and another factor is what led us to banning this card. So let's talk about that third factor now, and that is the overall impact on the format. While High Tide has not been the most played deck, that doesn't mean that it hasn't impacted the format in a really large way. A deck like this can impact a lot of people's deck choices and sideboarding choices, which High Tide certainly has. High Tide has really polar matchups. There's some matchups where it is incredibly favored because the opponent has no interaction that can deal with their hand or is slow, and they're just going to lose on turn 4 or 5 from the High Tide combo. And there are some matchups, like Fairies, that are so horrifyingly bad for High Tide that their win rates are below 20%, which is extraordinarily low for Game 1. The result of this has kind of been twofold. The first is that the decks that prey on High Tide have just gotten a boost in the metagame because they can win Game 1. Decks like Terror or Fairies are just a little bit stronger because if you play a High Tide opponent, you have a chance of winning the first game. Now that inherently is not bad. Decks get played because they're good against other decks all the time. But the second factor is a lot more problematic. Because High Tide kills you on turn 4 or turn 5 a lot of the time, and it's just racing to do so from hand, they're just setting up, it means that the best thing to do to help combat that, besides play a deck that's good against High Tide, is play a deck that can kill them if they don't do anything before turn 4 or turn 5. So it's really made decks want to blaze past other decks and not care about interaction, just killing the opponent as fast as possible. That generally leads to a worse experience for Pauper in general. And the more decks become these decks that are trying to go past each other and just throw cards at each other to win the game, I think the worse Pauper becomes as a result. This doesn't mean fast decks shouldn't exist, but we should incentivize Pauper to have a range, and High Tide kind of pushes against that goal. Now, after sideboarding, players gain cards that are good against High Tide, like Duresses and Blasts and so on. But still, it's not that fun when it becomes a race of how many sideboard cards you've drawn, and also I think the deck is surprisingly resilient. When I've been playing the deck, I've been duressed and blasted multiple times. I've even had someone disrupt my combo and come back on a future turn to then succeed in my combo. Now, once again, I don't want to describe too much of specific games or just my own personal experience, but the deck is a lot more resilient than I think folks give it credit for. Now, in terms of polarity, given we've banned cards like Monastery Swiftsphere from Red for creating too polar of a format, where Red was really advantaged in the first game and then fell off in subsequent games, that tells me that there's definitely a problem here, and to be consistent, we should be taking action against High Tide. So, ultimately, we had to ask ourselves the question, is High Tide making the format better? Is it making it more fun? Is it making it more enjoyable overall? And the answer to that was no. It's a deck with outlier win rates that creates an unfun play experience that also tends to impact the format. And so ultimately, after looking at it for a long time and watching it evolve, we decided to reban High Tide. We did talk about banning another card from High Tide and just letting the High Tide deck stay around in a weaker form, but ultimately, anything of that is just going to create shades of the original problem, and High Tide was the card on trial unban. So rather than try and play whack-a-mole this way, we just wanted to sunset High Tide in the format. I really want to stress that I and the PFP are still really happy with the experiment here. This idea of taking a card off the list to try out, seeing what happens, and then eventually rebanning it is still a worthwhile experiment to run, and we wouldn't get positive outcomes like Prophetic Prism if we weren't willing to try things like this. So overall, I'm still happy with how this turned out, even though it didn't end up with a new card being available in the format. I could see us trying it in the future, although we have no other plans to trial unbanned cards at this time. I do want to acknowledge, though, that because we took that extra time, it did lead to a little bit of inconsistency, where the window of when we're going to announce what happened with High Tide moved a few times, and then moved again once the BNR was moved back up. I want to apologize to everyone out there who's been waiting for a result on this deck to figure out if they want to end up picking it up themselves or so on. And normally we will not strive to do this in the future. This is a really unique situation with a number of pieces of why we needed to wait to get more data on High Tide, and then the BNR window moving up for other reasons. We did look at other decks in the format at this time to see if we wanted to do anything else, and decided not to do anything. The decks most on our radar are our Tolarian Terror-based decks, which have certainly grown over the past 6 months, although part of that could be due in part to High Tide being more popular, which Terror has a popular matchup against. So we wanted to knock High Tide out as a pillar of the format, and then see how Terror does once maybe more things like mid-range have a bit more game in the format. The other deck we looked at is this new Spy combo deck. Now, Balustrade, Spy, and Dread Return certainly have a pedigree of being strong in other formats, and so if we have to knock this someday, it wouldn't be a surprise to us, but it's still growing. It's still not clear how strong it is. The win rates are not anything to be concerned about, so we decided to leave it in its position for now, although we'll certainly be watching it in the future. It does play in dangerous space, which can be problematic. Overall though, the format does look pretty healthy. While High Tide was not the most fun thing to have around, the format still looks pretty good, which is part of why we were so reticent to make this change quickly. We were worried that knocking out the pillar of High Tide might dramatically reshape how the format looks as a whole, even though High Tide is not the most fun or healthy thing to have around. But hopefully, with High Tide gone, the format will continue to be healthy and players will continue to enjoy playing Pauper. Pauper Championship Week kicks off this week on Magic Online, so we'll be watching the results very closely to see how things look in the wake of High Tide's absence. Thank you so much for watching and enjoying playing Pauper, and we'll all talk to you again soon. On behalf of the entire Pauper format panel, this has been Gavin Verhey. And remember, you got this.